The politics of immigration policy are really difficult to discuss in 2017. And I think part of the problem is that the only voices that are clearly defined in the debate are left-wing extremists and right-wing extremists. I think if you ask the average person to define what is a moderate liberal position on immigration policy, they can't do it. The vast majority of people can't do it. They can't do it in America. They can't do it in Europe. They can't do it in England. They can't do it in Australia. If you ask someone to define what is a moderate conservative policy on immigration, they can't do it. However, it's very easy for people to define what's a right-wing white nationalist perspective, or what are the extremists in the left wing saying, or what are even the anarchists, extremists, anarcho-capitalists saying. Those are the voices we hear that are clearly defined, that speak in unison, and that are pulling the debate in one direction or another. Who's in the middle? What does it mean to be in the middle? What does it mean to be a moderate in an era when, in many ways, the nature and significance of immigration has fundamentally changed from what it was for any prior generation? Now, the context for this video, obviously, is that I've quite recently expressed contempt for far-right views. I've expressed my contempt for white nationalism. I've expressed my contempt for the so-called, white genocide discourse. However, if you've been watching the videos on my channel for a longer period of time, you may have seen I made just one or two videos talking about my views on refugee policy and immigration policy. And in them, I think many people would say I'm something like a moderate conservative, depending on what country you're living in and depending how you define those terms. And thus, people on the far left would perceive me as right-wing on those specific issues. Even though in recent videos I've made it very clear that I despise the right wing, I certainly despise the right wing's whole discourse about these issues. Now, it's especially phony, it's especially insincere for right-wingers to be talking about white genocide when they show zero sincere concern in very real historical genocides and ongoing genocides. If we're talking about the context of Australian immigration policy, very difficult question to talk about, a very important question to talk about. But I would say in the context of Australia, the moderate liberal position today, the moderate liberal position is that in the future, white people should not be the majority of Australians. Now, how do Indigenous people feel about that in Australia? They have become a minority in their own country. In some cases, locally, they've been completely eradicated. The island of Tasmania, from everything I've read, the number of people indigenous to Tasmania is now zero. Every single one was exterminated. I have read some other sources that claim there are a very small number of survivors here or there. Be that as it may, the island of Tasmania, which is part of Australia, if you don't know, that is an example of total genocide. So we have a discourse between what I would call the moderate liberals and the moderate conservatives, where the moderate liberals are saying that, yes, what they want is a multicultural future, what they want is a cosmopolitan future. And when you look at a map of Australia, they see no reason why Australia shouldn't become 10% Japanese, 10% Chinese, maybe 10% Indian, why they shouldn't gather in new talent, 10% Filipino, for the Philippines right next door, why they shouldn't be having very large numbers of Asian immigrants from across Southeast Asia and surrounding part of the world, Southeast Asia, South Asia, East Asia. And in this way, why Australia shouldn't make a transition from being a white-dominated, colonialist, genocidal society to being a multicultural, multi-ethnic, more diverse and cosmopolitan society, albeit one that is still built on genocide. Right? Now, in the Australian context, I find it very difficult to countenance that liberal view. It's a pro-globalization view and what have you, precisely because it ignores the special significance of the people for whom Australia is their home. You cannot make a simple statement of Australia for the Australians without recognizing who are the Australians, who are the Indigenous people of Australia, and to what extent is this their decision. I actually saw a lecture from a clergyman, a Christian preacher in Australia. I'm sorry, I forget his exact title, but he was a high-ranking representative of one of the Christian churches in Australia. I forget if he was Protestant or Catholic. And he made the point. He said, fundamentally, if the native people of Australia ask us to leave, ask white people to leave, we have to leave. That morally, he felt that was really important. That, they could have a referendum at any time. And if they were asked to leave a given area or the whole country, that white people in Australia had to be ready to do this. Now, as you can understand, that was shocking and controversial within Australia. But in the 21st century, this is exactly the type of scenario we have to deal with. So I received a very passionate email from one of my supporters on Patreon, who is French, and I can relate to the situation in France, especially because I myself was an immigrant in France. I went through the government process to become a French citizen, and I dropped out before it was completed. But I sat in the classroom with North African Muslims. I went through the assimilation lessons. We were formally taught what it means to assimilate into French culture by a French government official. You're taught about the political history of France, the status of religion and secularism in society in France. It's quite an interesting process. I learned a lot. I was in a classroom where 99% of the other students were Muslim. I think every single student was Muslim. Aside from myself, I'm a nihilistic atheist and I have no Muslim background. Aside from myself, there was one Tibetan student, one Cambodian student, and one Thai woman. No, and I also met one Chinese woman. But otherwise, out of the hundreds, everyone else was of Muslim ancestry and currently in the Muslim religion. There were no secular Muslims, none. And again, mostly from North Africa, a few from other parts of the Muslim world. I got to hear their perspective. I got to hear how the laws worked. And I got to hear both from the instructor and from the other students how in some cases they manipulate the laws, how they cynically do things that should be illegal, put it that way, and take advantage of the legal mechanisms that were there. It was a very interesting perspective on immigration in France. So I have an email from one of my Patreon supporters expressing his sincere concern about the extent to which, I have seen this myself, some cities in France, I can say this as a fact, in the south of France, in some cities in France, the downtown core of the city is now majority Muslim. I have seen that. And they're not assimilated Muslims. Some of them are legal immigrants and some of them are illegal. They're not speaking French, and they're very much intact, culturally intact examples of North African Islam that have migrated to France. And of course, there are tons of French people who are responding to this with alarm and saying this isn't what they signed up for. I have to frame this discussion, though, by pointing out the hypocrisy of people who express that concern, even if it is completely sincere. How do you think the Ojibwe feel? How do you think the Cree feel? How do you think the Navajo feel? How do you think Aboriginal Australians feel? How do you think black South Africans feel? All over the world, we have the reality of European colonialism and of real genocide. Look at almost anywhere in the Caribbean. There is some diversity of historical experience in the Caribbean. But the extremely violent history of the French Empire in the Caribbean. Have you heard of Haiti? Sorry, in French I believe it's pronounced IAT. But Haiti in the Caribbean. Haiti, Saint-Domingue, and this unbelievable history of French and Spanish colonialism in the middle of the Caribbean, which involves genocide and slavery and what have you. How would you feel if you were the indigenous people in any of those islands facing up to that reality? The current reality I've seen in the south of France with Muslim immigrants, it presents real challenges and real problems, and I'm willing to discuss them from my moderately conservative perspective on those issues. But I'm not willing to do it. I'm not willing to pretend that what we're talking about here is so-called white genocide. That is a very phony and very insincere narrative that everyone has to challenge. I mean this sincerely. If you're right-wing yourself watching this video, you have to challenge and reject this narrative in part by confronting it with and contrasting it to the reality of genocide all over the world. Okay? How does it feel to be a foreigner in your own country? Maybe you feel that way if you're in a city in France. If you go to the downtown core of any of the cities in southern France, where I live myself, and some of them I visited, some of them I was living in, some of them I was visiting. If you go to the downtown core and the majority of the people around you are Muslim immigrants and they're not speaking French, how do you feel? Okay, well now how do the Cree feel? How do the Ojibwe feel when in their own country they can't go to a hospital and speak their own language? They have to speak English or they have to speak French. Where there are no services, there's no education, there's no policing, there's no hospitals providing the language. There's a real question of the imposition of, shall we say, the imposition of authority from another country, another language, another sets of norms and standards and practices. Okay? Who wrote the laws in South Africa? In what language were those laws written? By what culture? Okay? Let's get real. There are French people who say that they are afraid of having Sharia law within France, having Muslim cultural ideas and laws imposed on France. Okay, but if that is a sincere concern, why do you not also have a sincere concern for the total extinguishment of native ways of life, moral values, and cultural values all over the world? But very obviously, in these examples I've already mentioned, by European colonialism. And when you look at that more broadly, if you focus on the imposition of European law, okay, South Africa is not a case of outright genocide. It was a white colonialist project with terrible crimes against humanity involved, but this imposed European languages, European culture, and European law on the native African people. That's very significant, although it's a different question from a situation like Quebec, where today in Quebec, 99% of people are not indigenous. They're white or they're other colonizing settlers. That's very different. South Africa is not 99% white people, so there's a different balance. But whether you look at an example like South Africa or another difficult example like Japan had its constitution written by the Americans. Hong Kong has its law written by the British. Okay, the idea, which is again part of this fear coming from the far right wing, of having foreign norms, laws, and institutions imposed on you, that may be a reasonable fear if stated in a reasonable way, but you're stating it in an unreasonable way and in a manner that is much worse than tone deaf to the ethical reality of recent and ongoing history of European colonialism all over the world. So, for example, I can quote this guy who just wrote to me on Patreon. He says that, he's trying to defend himself. He's trying to claim that he's not racist, which is understandable. Every one of these discussions has to clarify that they're not racist, it seems. He says that he believes Africa should be for the Africans. He says that he believes Europe should be for the Europeans. He says that he believes Asia should be for the Asians. But this is not historical reality. What is the historical reality of the French Empire in Cambodia? What is the historical reality of the French Empire in Vietnam? What is the historical reality of the British Empire in India? These are, or Pakistan, or many other places for the British Empire. Okay, these are cases precisely of Europeans colonizing Asia. None of them had the attitude of Asia for the Asians. And thus now they do not really have the luxury of saying that Europe should be for the Europeans. There is a real situation of a moral obligation that still links France to Vietnam and France to Cambodia. And I've seen that myself. It is much deeper than just white guilt. I mean, it really is. There are ongoing humanitarian projects and cultural exchanges. And the French government, they don't want to leave. If anything, they want to try to deepen cultural ties. The French government, French taxpayers keep paying to give free French lessons to anyone in Laos who wants to learn French. They don't. Most of them want to learn English. They don't want to learn French. But the French government will pay for this, and the French government keeps offering scholarships and special exchanges. They desperately want to cling to the little bit of influence they have in their former colonies in Vietnam and Laos. And they're quite eager to try to recruit significant numbers of immigrants from Vietnam and Laos to come to France to keep those ties alive, right? Now, why is that? Maybe that's a fascinating case study in many ways. But the historical reality is Europeans did not have the attitude that they should respect the sovereignty or the territorial integrity or even the legal integrity of a country like Vietnam, a country like Cambodia. They did the opposite. They imposed European laws there. They colonized it. They robbed the natural resources. They tried to get rich by doing things like opium dealing. In case you didn't know, both India and French Indochina, opium was the big game Europeans were trying to get rich quick from. Again, the British history of colonization in India. you can't now say so easily that there should be zero immigration or zero links, that there should be zero immigration from India to England, given the history of England's colonization and annexation of India. So that is part of the moral playing field we're on here. We're not talking about an even playing field. We're not talking about a situation in which this Patreon viewer can write to me saying, Africa is for the Africans. Look at the reality of South Africa. You can't just say Cambodia is for the Cambodians. You can't say that. And you are apparently a French citizen, sincerely concerned about problems of immigration in France. If you have a sincere concern, you have to demonstrate that concern with a real depth of analysis, with sincere analytical detachment on both sides of the equation. You have to look fairly, and I could say honorably, at the legacy of those colonial relationships, and in some cases, there are issues that are still ongoing. If you say you don't want to live in a country with Sharia law, I don't either. I don't want to live under Sharia law. But how do you think Cambodians feel when they live in a country where their laws were, in the past, written by the French, and then they were actually written by the United Nations? And they're in a process of trying to write their own laws, where their educational institutions and their hospitals were built by foreign powers, where to such a radical extent their society was reformed in Europe's image. And another really strange example is Japan, because Japan in many ways has become Americanized and has become Europeanized without being a formal colony in this way. One of my university professors in class showed photographs of downtown Shanghai before communism. He showed us a bunch of photographs of Shanghai and he said, what city do you think this is? Where is this in the world? They were beautiful black and white photographs of Shanghai. And the students couldn't guess. And he says, it looks like any city in Europe, doesn't it? He says, in fact, these are photographs of Shanghai. And he told us the years the photographs were taken. There was a time when, Shanghai, not an example of outright genocide, not the same as indigenous people in Australia, not the same as indigenous people in Canada, the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Mohawk. It's not like that. But nevertheless, there's a powerful question of European civilization being imposed on Asia, and of Asia being remade in a European image. So this is part of the reason why many people who are pro-cosmopolitan or pro-globalization have a sense of fair play now in saying that France should welcome in Cambodian culture, that France should welcome in Vietnamese culture, that England should welcome in India's culture, and that they should be open to some extent, having their cities influenced by and remade in the image of India, Cambodia, Vietnam. When was the last time you saw architecture that was distinctively Indian? Whether you live in France or England, wherever you live. When? Probably never, or maybe you've walked past a Hindu temple, but I kind of doubt it. When you walk down the street, wherever you are in the world, probably everything you see is European-style architecture. Okay? And guess what? I live in Asia, and the vast majority of the architecture I walk past is European too. It's 100% European architecture surrounding me. I don't see any authentic local tradition in the architecture. So the extent to which Asia has been Europeanized and the whole world has been Europeanized is something we have to recognize, and in many ways that is the basis for what's currently ongoing in globalization. This video is long enough. I don't really know if I'm going to be able to cover even 25% of what I wanted to say in this video. What is a moderate liberal position on Globalization Day, and what is a moderate conservative position on Globalization Day? I think, as I've said, the moderate liberals would be people, whether they're in Canada or Australia, who would say that they look forward to a future that is much more cosmopolitan, and where indeed white people may be the minority in Australia or white people may be the majority in Canada. That is currently So white people may become a minority in either Australia or Canada of a much more cosmopolitan country. However, I think it's also worth pointing out, they do completely assume that they'll still have a Westminster parliamentary system, that they'll still have a fundamentally British style of government, that they'll still have a fundamentally English language code of law and standards and practices, and they do so with reckless disregard for what Indigenous Canadians might want, and with no sense that in the future Indigenous people in Canada or Australia should have some important role, be it in Parliament or be it in the culture and language of the country or what have you. That Canadianness is in some meaningful sense linked to Indigenous Canadians, or that Australianness is linked in a meaningful sense to Indigenous Australians and their language, their culture, their history. So that is currently the moderate liberal perspective. And you can tell, even what I've said here, I disagree with it in a number of fundamental ways. I would say the moderate conservative perspective, one of the things that makes it powerful is that it's really built on skepticism. It's built on saying, let's look at these platitudes. Let's look at these vague platitudes about welcoming in all of humanity, of cosmopolitanism, of people living together in harmony. Let's look at the mechanisms of how this immigration actually works. And then what we discover is very often deeply problematic, subject to critique, subject to reform. And most of the reforms tend to less and less immigration. Now, what do I mean by this? When I was in France, for example, there was a principle in law that allowed anyone who spent 4 years in a French university to become a French citizen. So from all of North Africa, people who had the money to send their kids to university in France could sign up for this. And this was explained to me by a French government official. 3.5 years into their BA in a French university, they do a 4-year BA, they would apply for French citizenship. And actually, I remember the government official telling me if they're doing a shorter university diploma, they take extra courses, try to make it take longer, try to expand their diploma to be enough years or enough months to get this immigration process done. But about 3.5 years into their degree in France, they start the paperwork, and they can then get residency and then get citizenship just by virtue of getting a BA in France. Is that a smart policy or is that a stupid policy? Well, when you say everyone, you mean everyone. Obviously, that's going to welcome in people who would not qualify for citizenship if they were going through another type of process that scrutinized them, right? Now, I think some people in France would say, well, anyone who can get through a BA in France deserves citizenship. I got to tell you honestly, I'm not a French nationalist. I'm not French. I don't agree with that. I think that's completely ridiculous. I think that's a completely insane law to have. It's a completely insane form of social policy, even though I can see why it's well-intentioned, that probably people who wrote that law had good intentions and felt that they should welcome into the country anyone who goes through that process. Another law, and I met and spoke with at some length a young woman who was taking advantage of this law in France. Another law they had was along the lines of granting citizenship to anyone who attended French school. So here meaning primary school and high school, even if their parents were illegal immigrants. So I met a girl, she was in class with me as a legal immigrant, getting her French citizenship. She had just graduated, I don't know if just, but recently, maybe she graduated a couple years before. She had recently graduated from French high school, and she had attended all levels of schooling in France with both of her parents being illegal immigrants. So they came in as illegal immigrants, knowing about this law, intentionally abusing this law so that their daughter could become a citizen of France, which she did. She was doing it in front of my eyes, and she talked about with me exactly how that worked. Now, that law also, I can completely appreciate the humanitarian impulse behind it. French legislators probably sat down and said, look, we can't blame the children for the sins of their parents. Therefore, part of the law was that it guaranteed access to schools for these children. So even if the parents were illegal immigrants, children would still get free education. They'd still be welcomed into the French school system. And then at the end of their schooling, they got kind of fast-tracked to get paperwork and become French citizens. Well, that sounds grandiose and very positive when stated as a platitude, that you're doing the right thing to help these children who shouldn't be blamed for their parents' illegal immigration. But in reality, it's not just susceptible to abuse, it absolutely encourages illegal immigrants to come in and take advantage of this. So if the conservative position is in this way stated in terms of a methodological skepticism, of moving beyond platitudes about human equality, moving beyond platitudes about globalization and integration and living together in peace and harmony, to look at the real mechanisms of how countries choose who are their immigrants, and to skeptically criticize them, then in that sense, I absolutely am a moderate conservative. This is one of those areas of politics where the more you look at the details, the more your skepticism is rewarded, and the more troubling it is that we don't have healthy democratic debate and discourse about how this works. So this is a really, really strange area of public policy. And as I've said, even when I was in the classroom, in a classroom that was devoted to discussing this issue, a advanced seminar course in an academic setting with a professor who was supposed to be a specialist in this area. The professor was not capable of talking about these things calmly. She very often became irrational and irate and overly emotional and angry and what have you. My leitmotif for this video was to point out that we're now in a situation in 2017 where, first and foremost, nobody seems to be comfortable discussing these issues. Not professors in classrooms, not members of parliament in the House of Parliament, etc., etc. And where the only voices that are really clearly announced and consistent are the voices of left-wing extremists and, on the other hand, right-wing extremists. And where people find it very, very difficult to define or discuss what are the issues in the middle. And the moral of this story for me, again, I am a nihilist. I don't believe in any of the statements of platitude. I don't believe in any of the platitudes. I don't believe in any of the ideologies involved here. None of them. What I believe in is the overweening importance of focusing on those mechanistic and technical details. If you ask Canadians who controls immigration, the main answer you'll get is there's a point system. There's a point system. That means we don't have to think about it. Is the point system racist? Is the point system classist? Is there some reason why wealthy people from Hong Kong are favored by this point system and maybe not poor people who have other redeeming qualities that would make them great immigrants to Canada? Those are really hard issues to ask. To what extent does your point system reward people who may be wealthy and corrupt? And believe me, sir, I'm currently living in China. I speak Chinese. But if you think I have an uncritical attitude towards the impact on Canadian society of Canadian immigration policy trying to constantly recruit the wealthiest people from Hong Kong and China, that also has an impact on Canadian society that's really worth examining and really worth thinking about, although it's a very different impact from, say, recruiting refugees who are war veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan. These are very, very difficult questions to ask, very difficult questions to answer. And I think we fail to deal with them because they're both so ethically loaded. Nobody wants to be accused of being a racist. Nobody wants to admit their own ignorance. And admitting your own ignorance is a crucial first step towards learning. And then nobody wants to deal with these kinds of technical details. You can just say, oh, there is a point system. There is a bureaucracy handling it. Oh, there is a process for permanent residence status. Don't worry. Worry. You should worry. It's a choice ultimately made, whether by bureaucrats or by parliament or by local city hall, as they do it in Switzerland, that at the end of the day, it's a choice for who is going to be Canadian. What is the future of Canada going to be or become? And we have a very, very difficult decision to make in each country. Are we going to make those choices in a manner that's transparent and accountable, or are we going to sleepwalk through it because it's just something we can't stand to think about?